Chapter 3, Section 5, Active Transport, Endocytosis, and Exocytosis. Key concept. Cells use energy to transport materials that cannot diffuse across a membrane. Main ideas. Proteins can transport materials against a concentration gradient, and endocytosis and exocytosis transport materials across membranes in vesicles. First main idea. Proteins can transport materials against a concentration gradient. In the previous section, you just learned that some transport proteins let materials diffuse into and out of a cell down the concentration gradient. Many other transport proteins, often called pumps, move materials against a concentration gradient. Active transport drives molecules across a membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. This process, which is shown in the image on the screen here, uses transport proteins powered by chemical energy. Cells use active transport to get needed molecules regardless of the concentration gradient and to maintain homeostasis. Before we discuss active transport proteins, let's look at transport proteins in general. All transport proteins span the membrane, and most change shape when they bind to a target molecule or molecules. Some transport proteins bind to only one type of molecule, and others bind to two different types. Some proteins that bind to two types of molecules move both types in the same direction. Others move the molecules in opposite directions. The key feature of active transport proteins is that they can use chemical energy to move a substance against its concentration gradient. Most use energy from a molecule called ATP, either directly or indirectly. For example, nerve cells, or neurons, need to have a higher concentration of potassium ions and a lower concentration of sodium ions than the fluid outside the cell. The sodium-potassium pump uses energy directly from the breakdown of ATP. It pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell for every 2 potassium ions it pumps in. The proton pump, another transport protein, uses energy from the breakdown of ATP to move hydrogen ions, aka protons, out of the cell. This action forms a concentration gradient of hydrogen ions, remember the H+ ion, which makes the fluid outside the cell more positively charged than the fluid inside. In fact, this gradient is a form of stored energy that is used to power other active transport proteins. In plant cells, this gradient causes yet another protein to transport sucrose in the cell, which is an example of indirect active transport. Second main idea. Endocytosis and exocytosis transport materials across the membrane in vesicles. A cell may also use energy to move a large substance or a large amount of a substance in vesicles. Transport in vesicles lets substances enter or exit a cell without crossing through the membrane. Endocytosis is the process of taking liquids or fairly large molecules into a cell by engulfing them in a membrane. In this process, the cell membrane makes a pocket around a substance. The pocket breaks off inside the cell and forms a vesicle, which then fuses with a lysosome or a similar type of vesicle. Lysosomal enzymes break down the vesicle membrane and its contents, if necessary, which are then released into the cell. Phagocytosis is a type of endocytosis in which the cell membrane engulfs large particles. The word literally means cell eating. Phagocytosis plays a key role in your immune system. Some white blood cells called macrophages help your body fight infection. They find foreign materials such as bacteria and engulf and destroy them. Exocytosis, the opposite of endocytosis, is the release of substances out of a cell by the fusion of a vesicle with the membrane. During this process, a vesicle forms around materials to be sent out of the cell. The vesicle then moves toward the cell's surface, where it fuses with the membrane and releases its contents. Exocytosis happens all the time in your body. In fact, you couldn't think or move a muscle without it. When you want to move your big toe, for example, your brain sends a message that travels through a series of nerve cells to reach your toe. This message, or nerve impulse, travels along each nerve cell as an electrical signal, but it must be converted into a chemical signal to cross the tiny gap that separates one nerve cell from the next. These chemicals are stored in vesicles within the nerve cell. When a nerve impulse reaches the end of a cell, it causes the vesicle to fuse with the cell membrane and release the chemicals outside the cell. There, they attach to the next nerve cell, which triggers a new electrical impulse in that cell. This has been Chapter 3, Section 5, Active Transport, Endocytosis, and Exocytosis. Key concept: cells use energy to transport materials that cannot diffuse across the membrane. Main ideas: proteins can transport materials against a concentration gradient, and endocytosis and exocytosis transport materials across the membrane in vesicles.